Hey guys, let me tell you something about the ancient Egyptians that you probably didn't know. Well, unless you're one of those hardcore Egyptologists. Most people think of Egypt as this land of mystery and marvels. You've got the pyramids, the Sphinx, the Nile River, mummies, and, of course, the golden treasures of pharaohs. But what if I told you that underneath all that grandeur and mystique, there was a whole lot of, well, boring stuff? Seriously. The average person's day in ancient Egypt wasn't all that glamorous. Sure, they had their religion, their grand monuments, and the occasional royal drama. But at the end of the day, many people were stuck doing some of the most mind-numbingly dull jobs you could imagine. Now, don't get me wrong, ancient Egypt was a fascinating civilization. They were incredibly advanced in so many ways. But it's easy to forget that just like today, not everyone gets to be a king or a priest or some great warrior. The reality for the average Egyptian was much more grounded. And by grounded, I mean, well, sort of boring. Like, imagine having to wake up early every day, work all day in the blazing sun, do something repetitive and tedious, and then come home to a tiny mud brick house with very little comfort. It sounds like your typical Monday, doesn't it? But this was life for many in ancient Egypt, and it's kind of a shame we don't hear more about it. So let's talk about some of the weird, forgotten, and downright dull jobs people had back then. You might think of Egypt and picture grand architects designing pyramids or scribes writing hieroglyphs. But for every grand project, there were countless workers whose job was, well, less glamorous. These were the people who did the dirty work, the ones who didn't get to enjoy the luxuries of royal life. You've got to feel for them, right? I mean, sure, you had your craftsmen, your farmers, and your builders, but let's dive into the ones that really make you wonder why they even bothered. First up, we have the people who worked as sweeper priests. Yes, priests whose job was to clean the temples. That's right. In a place as glorified as ancient Egypt, where temples were seen as the earthly home of the gods, you'd think that maybe, just maybe, the job of keeping them clean would be reserved for someone a little more, well, noble. But no, there were priests who specialized in sweeping up the floors of the temples, making sure no dust, no matter how small, accumulated around the sacred statues. It's not the most glamorous gig, and yet it was an important one. I mean, who's going to want to worship at a temple if the floors are covered in dust? Not exactly the most spiritual environment. But it doesn't end there. You had the mouth scrapers. Now, this wasn't a job you'd want if you had any sort of dignity. A mouth scraper's job was exactly what it sounds like. They were responsible for cleaning the teeth of the dead. Not just any teeth, mind you, but the teeth of the pharaohs and high-ranking officials. These were people who scraped the teeth of the dead in preparation for their journey into the afterlife. I mean, talk about a thankless job. Imagine standing there with your little scraping tool, staring at the pharaoh's rotten teeth. It's no wonder they didn't get the glory that the architects or scribes did. It's hard to look heroic when you're scraping plaque off a mummy's teeth. Now, let's talk about something that's almost a universal in history: tax collectors. But in ancient Egypt, tax collectors had a very specific task. They had to measure the land to assess how much grain the farmers could produce. These guys were basically the ancient version of the IRS. They'd walk around, measuring plots of land, calculating how much grain could be harvested, and then telling the landowner how much tax they owed. It's a pretty dull job by today's standards, but it was even worse back then. You can imagine how fun it must have been to be the guy who shows up at someone's farm and tells them they owe a portion of their grain. People probably didn't exactly greet these tax collectors with open arms. And then, of course, there were the plasterers. These were the people who had the joyful task of smoothing and polishing the walls of tombs. Now, to be clear, the tombs themselves were grand, monumental structures. But the plasterers, they spent hours, days, and probably weeks just smoothing out the plaster that would cover the walls. It sounds like the most tedious job ever. You're covering up imperfections, making sure every surface is smooth, and not getting any credit for the incredible paintings and carvings that would eventually go on top of it. You'd think someone would at least throw them a party for their efforts. But nope. They just got to deal with the endless dust and toil, and let's not forget the food tasters. Now, you might think, hey, that sounds kind of fun. And sure, the idea of eating food prepared for a pharaoh might sound appealing. But think about it. If you're a food taster in ancient Egypt, you're constantly at risk of eating something that's been poisoned. You're basically the human equivalent of a canary in a coal mine, except your job doesn't come with a safety net. Sure, there's the chance of eating some delicious royal feasts, but you're always living with that unsettling feeling that your next bite could be your last. Not the most comforting thought when you're sitting down for lunch, right? And speaking of food, have you ever wondered how the ancient Egyptians dealt with their daily meals? It wasn't like they could just pop out to the local supermarket for some fresh produce. No, life for the average Egyptian was all about growing, harvesting, and preparing food by hand. Many people worked as farmers, cultivating crops like wheat, barley, and flax. The work was hard, often done under the scorching sun, and most people had to rely on the Nile's flooding to fertilize their fields. Imagine working from dawn to dusk, only to bring in your harvest and realize that it probably wasn't enough to feed your family for the next year. You'd think there'd be some sort of magic solution for this, but nope. Just more sweat, more toil, and a lot of frustration. Now, let's not forget the dung collectors. Yep, someone had to deal with the animal waste. Horses, donkeys, oxen, they all left their mark, and there was someone whose job it was to clean it up. These workers would gather the dung, and it wasn't just thrown away. Oh no, it had a much more practical purpose. The dung was often used as fertilizer for crops. So, in a way, these workers were providing a valuable service. But it doesn't change the fact that they were literally picking up after animals all day long. Not exactly a glorious job, but important nonetheless. Then there were the fishers. Now, fishing in ancient Egypt wasn't the tranquil activity it might be today. It was a grueling job. You didn't just cast a line into a serene pond. No. You were wading into the Nile, pulling in nets full of fish by hand, and this was no small task. The fish had to be collected, cleaned, and sold, all before the day's end. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fun, it was exhausting, back-breaking work that likely involved a lot of smelly fish guts. But hey, at least you weren't just sitting around all day. And finally, let's talk about the linen workers. Now, you might think that the Egyptians had the best linen in the world. After all, it was lightweight, breathable, and great for the hot desert climate. But the process of making that linen was incredibly tedious. You had workers who spun flax into thread, then wove it into cloth. It sounds like something you'd want to do while sitting back and relaxing. But no, this was hard labor. And it wasn't like they were making fine linen for their own use. No, these workers were making linen for the rich and powerful. They didn't get to wear the fine clothes. They wore whatever scraps were left over. And it wasn't just about making clothes. The linen also had to be used for other purposes like wrapping mummies. So, you're not just making regular fabric, you're making the wrapping for the dead. A rather grim job, if you ask me. So, you see, while ancient Egypt might seem like this mystical place of grandeur and mystery, the everyday jobs people had were, well, a little less than magical. Most people didn't get to live the high life. They weren't building pyramids or making royal decrees. They were just trying to get through their day without stepping in too much dung or having to taste poisoned food. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exciting. But it was necessary. And that, my friends, is the strange, boring, and often forgotten side of ancient Egypt. All right, so if you thought that life in ancient Egypt was all about pharaohs and pyramids, it might be time to rethink that. Sure, they built the wonders of the world, had some pretty impressive tombs, and managed to invent some amazing things. But let's talk about the reality for most people. The ones who weren't enjoying the luxury of royal feasts and gold-plated chariots. Take, for example, the people whose job it was to collect dung. Yes, you heard that right. This wasn't just some odd, obscure job nobody ever heard of. It was actually crucial to the functioning of ancient Egyptian society. See, in an agricultural society, dung was a key part of life. It was a fantastic fertilizer for the crops, but collecting it was, well, a bit of a chore. And not just any chore. It was messy, smelly, and generally unpleasant. You could be walking around the fields doing your job and bam, you'd step right into a pile of it. And not just once. It's like they had a knack for sneaking up on you when you least expected it. But you had to get the dung. People needed it. Without it, their crops wouldn't grow. If you're lucky, you might have even been able to find some dried-out animal dung. But even then, you'd still be stuck with the task of collecting, moving, and eventually spreading it across the land. The rich folks didn't have to worry about this. No, they had their servants to do all the dirty work. Let's also not forget about the ancient Egyptian scribes. Now, these guys had a slightly better gig than the dung collectors, but it wasn't exactly as glamorous as people think. Sure, they were responsible for recording everything, the pharaoh's decrees, the number of grains harvested, how much gold was in the treasury, and, of course, the tax records. But do you know how they did this? They didn't have fancy computers or even pens. Nope, they used reed brushes and ink, often writing on papyrus scrolls. And if you think that sounds romantic, just wait until you realize how difficult it was. You had to be precise. One slip of the brush, and the whole thing could be ruined. And don't even get me started on how long it took to make these scrolls. It was hours, maybe even days of work for just one document. That's not even mentioning how uncomfortable it must have been to sit there cross-legged on hard floors for hours on end, trying to keep your mind sharp as you scribbled down figures about taxes and grain production. So, yeah, being a scribe wasn't this glamorous job that involved deciphering ancient hieroglyphs while sipping wine and lounging in the shade. It was long, boring hours of making sure every mark on the papyrus was just right. And if you were lucky, you might get a nice meal afterward. If not, well, tough luck. Maybe you could treat yourself to a piece of bread. And let's not forget that the scribes were often the ones who had to write out the official letters telling people they owed taxes. So, yeah, being a scribe wasn't exactly a cushy desk job. But if you think that's bad, there's the role of the night watchman. These were the guys whose job it was to patrol the streets at night, making sure everything was calm and safe. Sounds like an easy enough job, right? Just walk around the city, maybe keep an eye on things. The thing is, they were often stationed in some of the most remote parts of the city, and they didn't get any fancy tools to help them out. Forget flashlights. The night watchman would have been stuck wandering in the dark with nothing but a stick to make noise and keep away any potential trouble. And if they did find anything suspicious, well, it wasn't like they had backup. It was just them and their wits, hoping they wouldn't be caught in a dark alley by a group of bandits or wild animals. And, let's face it, no one's getting a promotion for walking around in the dark every night. It was a job you did because you had no choice, not because it was glamorous. Then we get to the royal food tasters. Yeah, you heard that right. These poor souls were employed to taste food before it was served to the king or queen. It sounds kind of cool at first, getting to eat the royal feast, right? But there's a catch. These tasters weren't just sampling food to make sure it was delicious. No. They were there to make sure the food wasn't poisoned. So every time they bit into a piece of bread or a juicy slice of roast meat, they were probably thinking, "Is this my last meal?" The pressure was on. They had to trust that the food wouldn't make them keel over and die within the next few hours. And if they survived the tasting, well, then the food was probably deemed safe for the royal table. But if they didn't, well, it wasn't pretty. And let's not forget about the people who were involved in the whole process of mummification. We've all seen the images, the beautifully wrapped bodies of Egyptian pharaohs with their intricate bandages and golden masks. But the people who worked in these tombs, they didn't get to enjoy the glories of being immortalized in gold. No, they were there to prepare the bodies for burial. They had to strip the flesh from the bones, remove organs, and preserve everything with oils and resins. It wasn't just about preserving a body for the afterlife. It was about making sure everything was done perfectly, because the slightest mistake could result in a poor pharaoh not making it to the next life. So, these workers were dealing with some pretty gross stuff on a regular basis. The smell alone must have been enough to make anyone reconsider their life choices. As the workers prepared the bodies, they also had to make sure the tomb was ready. That meant painting the walls with elaborate scenes of the pharaoh's life, scenes of grandeur, of battles, and of gods blessing the king's reign. It wasn't just about the body itself. It was about making sure the afterlife was as grand as possible. The whole process of preparing someone for the afterlife was not only physically draining, but it was mentally taxing as well. Think about it. You're in a dark tomb, surrounded by dead bodies, trying to make sure everything is perfect. The pressure to get it right must have been intense. And as for the people who worked in the royal gardens, well, their job wasn't exactly as glamorous as you might imagine. While we think of royal gardens as being beautiful, peaceful places, these workers had to tend to them in sweltering heat, using tools that weren't exactly the most efficient. They'd spend hours each day trying to make sure the plants were properly watered, trimmed, and arranged. It wasn't a job that involved much glory. No, it was just hot, tiring work. You'd spend your days kneeling in the dirt, making sure the royal flowers were in perfect condition. And let's not forget, you didn't get to enjoy the fruits of your labor. Those royal gardens weren't for you. They were for the pharaoh and his family to enjoy. All in all, the jobs of ancient Egypt were often far from glamorous. The reality of everyday life for most Egyptians wasn't filled with luxury or excitement. It was about surviving, about doing what needed to be done to keep society functioning. Sure, there were moments of grandeur, tomb paintings, feasts, and royal decrees, but for most people, life was about working long hours in less than ideal conditions, and those forgotten occupations, the strange and often boring jobs, they were just part of the machinery that kept ancient Egyptian society running. Not all jobs were about building pyramids or wearing gold. Some were about the quiet, unnoticed work that made everything else possible. And as we move further through the annals of history, the picture of the ordinary worker in ancient Egypt only becomes clearer. The vast majority of people were involved in these tedious, often forgotten jobs. It wasn't the stuff of legend or mythology, it was just hard, repetitive work. The kind of work that doesn't make it into the grand stories of civilization, but is necessary to keep everything running. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most fascinating part of all. So let's dive deeper into some of these forgotten jobs. One of the most peculiar roles in ancient Egypt was that of the mud brick maker. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait, wasn't that just a job for slaves? Well, kind of. But there were specialized workers whose sole job was to make bricks. And not just any bricks, mud bricks. The same kind of mud bricks that were used in constructing the temples, homes, and even the pyramids. Imagine your day-to-day life being all about collecting clay, shaping it into bricks, and then drying those bricks under the intense Egyptian sun. Not exactly glamorous, right? It wasn't like you could just whip up a quick batch and move on to your next task. No, the process took days. The mud had to be collected from the Nile's banks, then mixed with straw, to give it the right texture. Too much straw, and the bricks would crumble. Too little, and they'd crack under the weight of a building. So you had to get the proportions just right. And of course, the drying process had its own unique set of challenges. Too much sun, and the bricks would crack. Not enough sun, and they would remain too soft to be used in construction. Then there were the beetle catchers. Yes, you read that correctly. In ancient Egypt, beetles weren't just pests to be ignored or squashed underfoot. Oh, no. These little creatures played a much more important role in society. Beetles were used in various religious ceremonies, often as symbols of rebirth, transformation, and protection. And so, in a culture deeply connected to the natural world, it was the job of certain workers to catch and collect these beetles. Not only did they need to find the beetles, but they also had to know how to care for them. You couldn't just toss them in a box and call it a day. These beetles had to be kept in a very specific environment to keep them alive and healthy for rituals. Let's not forget the mummy handlers. While the high priests and nobles got to work on the elaborate mummification rituals, imbuing the bodies with oils, herbs, and resins, there were lower-tier workers who were responsible for much of the manual labor. These individuals were responsible for transporting the bodies, placing them on the embalming tables, and even preparing the tombs. It wasn't as glamorous as it sounds. The embalming room was likely hot, smelly, and the air thick with the scent of resin and herbs. You were basically dealing with decomposing bodies all day, performing a task that was crucial to Egyptian society, but not one that would get you a lot of social recognition. And speaking of recognition, let's take a look at some of the less than heroic jobs that didn't get a lot of spotlight. For example, the water carriers. Now, when we think of ancient Egypt, we tend to focus on the grand pyramids, the majestic Nile, and the glittering pharaohs. But in reality, there was a huge demand for workers who simply carried water. These workers would fill up large jugs at the Nile or at wells, and then lug them to various households or work sites. It wasn't a particularly difficult job physically. It wasn't like they were hauling giant stones, but it was endlessly repetitive. Imagine walking back and forth across the same path day in and day out, just carrying water for hours. Now, there were those who had jobs that were slightly more prestigious. Take, for example, the scribe. Being a scribe was, without a doubt, one of the more enviable positions in ancient Egypt. After all, they could write. And in a society that valued the written word as much as Egypt did, that was a big deal. But it wasn't all glamorous. Being a scribe meant long hours of studying hieroglyphs, learning the complex art of writing, and copying down official decrees, laws, and tax records. It wasn't just a matter of scribbling on papyrus. It required immense focus and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Mistakes weren't tolerated. After all, you were recording history here. Your work was going to be preserved for thousands of years. No pressure, right? Scribes were highly respected, but they also spent much of their time indoors, hunched over scrolls. The heat of the desert, the constant threat of malaria, and the dust of the city were all kept at bay inside the cool stone walls of their workspaces. However, they weren't always safe from one particularly uncomfortable reality. The very ink they used to write was toxic. Made from soot, gum, and water, the ink could easily poison the careless scribe who might have neglected to wash their hands. So imagine working in an ancient office, writing down some important royal decree, and then being left with a rash or worse because you didn't clean up after yourself properly. Just another small inconvenience in the grand life of a scribe. Then there's the world of the cattle herders. Now, herding cattle in ancient Egypt might sound like a pretty straightforward, if somewhat dull, job. After all, you just gather the cattle, move them to the fields, make sure they don't wander off, and feed them, right? Well, it wasn't quite that easy. Cattle were very important to the Egyptians. They provided milk, meat, and leather, and the Egyptians used them for plowing fields. But cattle could also be pretty unpredictable. A herd could easily stampede if startled, and you'd need to be quick on your feet to manage them. And the heat? The scorching heat of Egypt could make a day spent chasing cattle utterly miserable. If you were lucky, you got to spend your day in the fields, where the grass was thick and the cattle were calm. But more often than not, you found yourself chasing after stray animals, hoping they didn't end up in the nearby river or getting caught by predators. Of course, it wasn't just cattle that needed herding. There were also goat herders. While goats were far less glamorous than cattle, especially in a society that placed so much importance on large livestock, being a goat herder was still a significant job in ancient Egypt. Goats were a staple source of food for many people, especially in more rural areas. They provided milk, meat, and even wool. But let's be honest, goats are not the easiest animals to deal with. They're stubborn, independent creatures that like to wander off and do their own thing. If you've ever tried to herd a goat, you know exactly how difficult it can be. And in the heat of Egypt, this job was particularly exhausting. You'd spend hours in the sun chasing after goats who were more interested in eating the neighbor's garden than following you where you needed them to go. Not exactly the glamorous pastoral life some might imagine. But the strangest of all might just have been the pyramid text scribes. These were workers tasked with inscribing the walls of the pyramid with prayers, texts, and spells designed to ensure the pharaoh's safe passage into the afterlife. Sure, it sounds impressive, doesn't it? Inscribing the great pyramids with sacred texts, preserving the very essence of Egyptian culture and religion. But think about the logistics of this job for a second. You're up on a scaffold with nothing but a chisel and a hammer, carving intricate symbols and lines into the stone of the pyramid. Not only did you have to be incredibly skilled, but you also had to work quickly. The stones were heavy, the weather was sweltering, and there was a constant pressure to finish the job before the pharaoh's tomb was sealed. And if you made a mistake? Well, mistakes were considered not just errors, but omens. No pressure at all. What's truly bizarre about these jobs is that most of them were completely necessary for the functioning of ancient Egyptian society. But none of them had the prestige or glory that came with being a king, priest, or general. These roles, while integral to the smooth operation of daily life, were often overlooked in favor of the more exciting and adventurous positions. The people doing this work, like brickmakers, beetle catchers, and pyramid scribes, were the unsung heroes of ancient Egypt. Their contributions were hidden in the shadows, their names lost to time. But without them, there would be no pyramids, no elaborate tombs, and no civilization to celebrate in the first place. Sometimes, the most important jobs are the ones that go unnoticed. And so, as we look back on these forgotten occupations, we begin to realize that history isn't just about the grand, sweeping events. It's also about the quiet, mundane lives of those who kept the wheels of society turning, the jobs that no one remembers, but that were crucial to the survival of ancient Egypt. If you want to understand what life was really like back then, it's not enough to just focus on the pharaohs and the gods. You have to take a look at the everyday workers, the ones who toiled in the background, making sure that the civilization ran smoothly, even if no one was there to applaud them for their efforts. So let's dig even deeper into these peculiar and sometimes incredibly dull jobs that kept ancient Egypt running like a well-oiled, albeit rather grimy machine, because, let's face it, there's a lot more to life in ancient Egypt than just building pyramids and getting wrapped up like a mummy. If you were living in those days, there were plenty of less than glamorous jobs that kept the entire system intact. Some of these jobs were so obscure, so unremarkable, that you'd be lucky if your name was even remembered in a dusty scroll somewhere, let alone celebrated in the grand stories passed down through history. Take, for example, the doorkeepers. Sounds important, right? Maybe some sort of elite guard standing by the palace doors, armed and ready to defend the pharaoh? Well, not quite. These were just regular folks, typically stationed by doors, probably in the back corners of courtyards, performing the vital task of standing in front of entrances to official buildings, offering no real protection. But hey, they were doing something right. They were, in fact, responsible for making sure nobody just wandered into the wrong room. Not exactly the stuff of legend, unless, of course, you were really into doors. But they had to be there. After all, someone needed to look after all those doors. And then we have the pool keepers. Now, if you're imagining someone lounging poolside, handing out cool drinks and towels, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. These were the poor souls who maintained the water in Egypt's pools and canals. You might think this job sounds pretty chill. After all, who wouldn't want to be near water all day in the sweltering heat of Egypt? But nope. Maintaining water sources in ancient Egypt was an incredibly labor-intensive, thankless task. These keepers weren't just watching water evaporate lazily under the sun. They were constantly digging, cleaning, and moving water from one place to another, ensuring it didn't get contaminated. When you really think about it, it's kind of like being stuck in an endless cycle of yard work, only with much less shade and a lot more dirt. And for all their efforts, the pool keepers didn't even get to take a refreshing dip themselves. No, their role was purely maintenance. Though, if we're being real, maintenance sounds a lot better than the alternative, which was filling in for something else. Speaking of jobs that are way less glamorous than they sound, let's talk about the ancient Egyptian beekeepers. Now, bees, sure, honey, sweet, a little sticky, but hey, who doesn't love honey, right? Sounds like a fine job. Except that beekeeping wasn't just about collecting honey from a bunch of buzzers. Oh no, it was far more exhausting than that. Imagine a day spent walking around the desert, herding swarms of bees into little clay jars, dodging stings, and trying not to get covered in sticky, sweet mess. Ancient Egyptians didn't have the high-tech beekeeping tools we have now. No protective suits, no smoker gadgets to calm the bees. They were just dealing with hundreds of bees, possibly covered in the sticky residue of honey all day long, and probably running the risk of getting stung with every step. Their reward for all that? A nice jar of honey to be used in religious ceremonies, or maybe mixed into an ointment. But not enough to justify the endless agony of dealing with bees every single day. Then there were the people who did the boring, repetitive task of cleaning out the temples. You might think that the priests and high-ranking officials would be the ones cleaning out the sacred spaces, but no, those jobs were usually delegated to people who were lower on the social ladder. These were the people who scrubbed, swept, and dusted the sacred sites, ensuring the gods' homes stayed presentable. So imagine yourself stuck in the grand temples of Egypt, sweeping up endless amounts of dust and sand, cleaning up after ceremonies, and generally performing what was essentially housekeeping on a monumental scale. But here's the twist. Most of the time, the workers doing this weren't getting much credit. The temples were magnificent, the gods were revered, and the ceremonies were glorious. But the people cleaning up after all the divine action, well, they were just nameless, faceless laborers whose contribution was forgotten once the floors were clean. Sure, they were part of something bigger, but there's not much glory in making sure the tiles are properly swept in the god's living room. Speaking of temples and the people who worked in them, there were also the ancient Egyptian sacred scribes who recorded the mundane. While you might be thinking these scribes were out there documenting grand ceremonies or recording the history of Egypt's dynasties, a lot of their time was spent documenting incredibly dull aspects of life. Think inventory lists, tax records, and even grocery shopping lists. Sure, they got to write using fancy hieroglyphics, but most of their work was simply transcribing the boring details of daily life. Things like the amount of grain in a warehouse or how many slaves had been assigned to a particular task. This wasn't the kind of writing that would get you remembered as a legendary poet. It wasn't even the kind of work that would get you much respect. But it was important. If you didn't have people tracking grain, you'd have a whole lot of hungry people. But imagine the sheer boredom of looking at a ledger and writing down 15 bushels of wheat, 7 cows. Doesn't sound like the most thrilling job in ancient Egypt, does it? And don't even get me started on the people who cleaned out the tombs. Now, tomb cleaning. That's something that definitely doesn't get mentioned in any of the romanticized stories about Egypt. We often hear about the grand pyramids and the treasures inside tombs, but what we don't hear about are the people tasked with cleaning up the dusty, musty tombs. They didn't have the luxury of writing grand epics about their exploits. They were just doing the dirty, unpleasant work, removing the dead bodies that didn't make it, scraping off old bandages, and preparing the tombs for new burials. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic, but it was necessary. These workers didn't get credit for any of it. They were probably just seen as the guys who cleaned up after death, which is far from an enviable position. Even the ancient Egyptian watchmen, who guarded sacred sites and royal structures, weren't living the high life. Sure, they had the essential task of protecting the pharaoh's tomb, the pyramids, and other important sites. But it wasn't an exciting job. They weren't facing off against bandits or keeping evil spirits at bay. Their main duty was to sit there and stare into the darkness, occasionally doing patrols, listening for noises that probably didn't exist. When you're assigned to guard a pyramid, there's not much to do but look at a giant rock and make sure no one walks past. It's not like you're going to be fighting off robbers all night. And if anything did go wrong, well, it wasn't going to be because of the guard. It's the kind of job where you're forgotten the moment the sun rises. But they still had to be there. So, next time you imagine yourself in the ancient world, don't just picture the glorious pyramids and the pharaohs ruling over the lands. Think about the people who made those things happen, the ones who got little or no recognition for their work, but without whom Egypt would never have achieved its glory. They were there, doing their jobs, and somehow making it all work. The forgotten, the dull, and the absolutely necessary jobs. The ones that didn't require bravery or intellect, but simply patience and the willingness to do whatever it took to keep things running. Sure, it wasn't glamorous, but without them, there would have been no pyramids, no royal tombs, no thriving civilization. It's the unsung workers of ancient Egypt who made everything else possible, even if we'll never know their names. And let's not forget, even today, we rely on those same kinds of jobs to keep things running smoothly. People behind the scenes who are rarely seen, but whose work is vital to the function of society. Sure, we don't have to worry about cleaning tombs, but think about all those background roles that go unnoticed in our modern world. It turns out life hasn't changed all that much since ancient Egypt. We just have better air conditioning now. So, picture this. You're living in ancient Egypt, surrounded by all the majesty and grandeur we associate with it. You're working in one of those strange, long-forgotten jobs, one that didn't involve swinging swords or plotting devious schemes, but was just as vital. You're not out there building the pyramids or carving statues of gods. You're one of those people who keeps things running. It's hot, it's dusty, and nobody really notices your work unless it goes wrong. Sounds like the worst, right? Well, buckle up, because I'm about to take you through the truly bizarre, strangely uncelebrated, and frankly boring daily grind of ancient Egypt. It might make you feel a little bit better about your own job. Let's start with something you might not have thought about. Those ancient Egyptian tombs. Now, these weren't just decorative. They were elaborate, serious affairs, meant to guarantee the dead had a comfortable afterlife. These tombs needed to be built, decorated, and maintained, and for that, you needed an army of workers. These workers weren't carving intricate hieroglyphs or painting scenes of the afterlife, though. No, they were the ones who made sure the place didn't fall into disrepair, the ones who cleaned up the mess left behind, and the ones who constantly swept away the sand and dust that accumulated over time. Imagine being one of those people. Your job is literally to clean the tombs. Day after day, you're just sweeping up dust and maybe fixing a crack in a wall here and there with no glory or recognition. But without you, the tombs would be a complete disaster, and no one would be able to appreciate the real artistry of the pharaoh's resting places. Speaking of those tombs, how about the people responsible for maintaining the sacred animals? We're talking about the ones who tended to the sacred animals like cats, birds, and other creatures that had significant religious meaning in Egypt. Sounds pretty nice, right? Maybe even a bit noble? Well, not exactly. Sure, it was a job with a certain prestige in religious circles, but it wasn't as glamorous as you might think. These workers weren't walking around in fine linen, gently petting royal cats. They were cleaning up after them. Yes, you read that right. Imagine spending your days in a hot, smelly temple, sweeping up cat hair, cleaning out cages, and trying to make sure the animals were well fed and content. And the weirdest part, if one of the sacred animals died, it wasn't like today where you just bury your pet in the backyard. No, in ancient Egypt, there were elaborate mourning rituals. If a sacred animal died, it was a major event, and part of your job was to mourn in the most dignified way possible, while probably standing knee-deep in animal waste. I'm not saying it was a terrible gig, but I'm definitely not jealous of these guys. Now, let's talk about one of the most thankless jobs in all of ancient Egypt, the official tomb sweeper. Sure, this one might seem like it's in the same family as the cleaning up after sacred animals job, but it's even more thankless than you might expect. You're not dealing with the glamorous, elaborate tombs of the royals here. No, you're responsible for the tombs of everyday people, the ones that get ignored and covered in sand over the centuries. This job was so mundane and unrewarding that it's often completely overlooked by historians. But, as always, this was crucial. Without these unsung heroes making sure tombs didn't collapse under the weight of centuries of neglect, we wouldn't even have the chance to find those tombs in the first place. So next time you feel a little irritated about your job, just remember, at least you're not spending your days sweeping away the accumulated debris of centuries. The ancient Egyptians also had a particularly strange system for ensuring their workers stayed busy. Picture this. Ancient Egypt's official bureaucracy had a job for almost everything, even things you wouldn't expect. Take, for instance, the role of the water carrier. Now, you might think, well, that doesn't sound too bad. I can carry water. But here's the catch. It wasn't just any water you were carrying. You had to haul it from the Nile, and not in a nice, breezy trip either. The water had to be clean, fresh, and perfectly appropriate for the rituals and ceremonies. The authorities didn't want just any water splashed around their sacred sites or homes. They wanted the best. And the worst part? You didn't get to enjoy the water. No one was like, oh, hey, water carrier, take a break and have a drink. No, this was grueling work. And if you didn't do it just right, the whole ritual or offering could be ruined, leaving you to feel the wrath of those in charge. You might be wondering, does anyone even remember these poor souls? Not really. But without them, everything would come to a halt. Then there were the sweat men. This is one of the most bizarre jobs in ancient Egypt. These were workers tasked with laborious jobs that caused them to sweat, building the pyramids or hauling materials under the scorching sun. So they were called sweat men because, well, they sweated a lot. You didn't get a cool uniform or a nice fan to keep you cool. Nope. You just worked long hours lifting, carrying, and sweating in the sun. And no, it wasn't like today, where you can at least grab a cold drink or take a break in air conditioning. These workers were out in the heat, day after day, with nothing but a few scraps of cloth to protect them from the sun. And the worst part? No one cared about them. The pyramid builders were celebrated, the architects were revered, but these sweat men, they were just there, toiling away. Their names aren't in any history books, and if they had a moment to rest, it was only because the sun had finally set. Of course, Egypt had its fair share of other strange jobs as well. There were the people who made sure the royal barge was ready for ceremonial use. You might think, that sounds kind of cool. Royal barges were magnificent with all the gold and luxury of ancient Egypt. But your job? To scrub the thing clean. You didn't get to ride in it. You didn't get to show it off. You just made sure it was shiny and pristine, so the royal family could use it when they needed to. You spent your days washing, polishing, and inspecting the boat, making sure everything was in order for that big royal event. If you didn't do your job right, the entire royal journey could be ruined, and you'd likely face the wrath of whoever was in charge. So, next time you think your job is a little repetitive, just remember the poor souls who were stuck polishing boats they'd never get to use. Let's not forget the role of the ancient Egyptian mummy maker. Mummification, as you probably know, was a key part of ancient Egyptian life, especially for the wealthy and powerful. But the person responsible for the process was no artist, no revered craftsman. No, it was someone whose entire job revolved around scraping the flesh from the bones of the dead, wrapping them up, and making sure they were immortalized properly. It was a grueling, monotonous task, and one that involved a lot of gruesome work. The irony of mummification is that while it was seen as a sacred and revered process by the elite, those who performed it were often the lowest on the social totem pole. These workers would spend their days embalming bodies, handling the dead, and then watching as the rich enjoyed their eternal glory. And yet, the mummification specialists didn't get any recognition. They were essentially the forgotten ones behind the scenes of the grand funerary rituals, ensuring the rich stayed dead and glorious for eternity. Think about that the next time you hear about the wonders of ancient Egypt. So, here's the thing. Ancient Egypt had an entire world of forgotten jobs that no one ever talks about. They were mundane, repetitive, and probably smelly. These people didn't get to live out the epic tales we love so much. But they were essential. Without their steady hands and diligent work, the Egyptian empire might have never achieved the heights it did. You won't find their names on monuments or in the annals of history, but without them, there wouldn't have been much of a civilization to write about in the first place. To wrap it up, let's just say, if you're ever feeling like your job is too boring, too repetitive, or too thankless, remember that there were people who worked their whole lives just to keep the ancient world functioning, without so much as a thank you or a good job. They weren't living the glamorous lives of pharaohs or scribes. They were the ones doing the hard, dirty work. And without them, Egypt's grandiosity might have just been a pile of sand and rubble. Hey guys, let me tell you something that might completely change the way you think about one of the most romanticized periods in history. We all know that ancient Egypt was a land of grand monuments, gods, and pharaohs who lived in palaces surrounded by gold. But have you ever stopped to think about the people who spent their days doing all the dirty, repetitive, and frankly boring work that made all that grandiosity possible? Probably not. I mean, who wants to think about the people who didn't get to live the epic life of a king or a noble scribe? But here's the thing. Without them, Egypt wouldn't have been the powerhouse it became. No one ever talks about the background characters in history, but those people were just as essential, if not more so, than the ones who got all the glory. So let's take a look at some of the strangest, most forgotten jobs in ancient Egypt. These were the roles that made the whole operation run. They were jobs that no one in their right mind would ever dream of having today. And yet, somehow, they kept everything ticking along for thousands of years. Let's start with the one occupation that I'm pretty sure no one in ancient Egypt ever wrote about with enthusiasm: the dung collector. If you've ever wondered who was responsible for cleaning up after the animals in the streets of ancient Egyptian cities, then wonder no more. It was the dung collector's job. Yep, these poor souls spent their days scraping up animal waste. And you know how ancient Egypt was filled with animals: horses, donkeys, cattle, camels, and whatever else they decided to ride around in or keep as livestock. It was a lot of poop, but not just any poop. The dung had to be collected and carted off to be used as fertilizer for crops. Yes, ancient Egypt was so advanced that they figured out how to turn crap into something useful. But let's be real. If you were the person responsible for picking it up, I don't think you were getting any applause for your efforts. You weren't getting a monument or a statue. You were just doing your job, day in and day out, in the blazing Egyptian heat, with no reward beyond your daily bread. Honestly, it was probably a thankless, gross job that no one wanted, but somebody had to do it. I'd love to see someone from a modern job come back in time and try that one on for size. But dung collectors weren't the only forgotten workers. Let's talk about the brickmakers. If you've ever visited a pyramid or seen pictures of the great temples of Egypt, you've probably marveled at the massive stones that were used to build them. Those stones didn't just magically appear. They had to be shaped, moved, and put into place by the hands of laborers who worked with unimaginable precision. But the brickmakers? Oh, they were the ones who got to do the fun job of making bricks. They worked with clay, straw, and mud to make the bricks that were used in the construction of everything from homes to temples to monuments. It's hard to imagine how miserable it must have been to work in the sun, covered in dust and grime, shaping bricks all day. Sure, they weren't being forced to haul massive stones from quarries, but making those bricks was a slow, monotonous task that required a lot of precision. And unlike the monumental stones, you won't find their names etched anywhere. No one bothered to carve a brickmaker's name into a wall. Yet, without those bricks, Egypt's architectural wonders might never have been built. They might have been left in the drawing stages, or worse, never conceived of in the first place. And while we're at it, let's not forget that the people who made the bricks didn't exactly have the luxury of air conditioning or modern equipment. Their work was done with primitive tools under the scorching sun, probably for long hours. You'd think they might have been given some credit, but nope. History doesn't remember them. They were just the ones who made sure the walls stayed up. But it wasn't just the brick makers and dung collectors who lived under the radar. There were also the workers who were responsible for the upkeep of Egypt's irrigation systems. Egypt, of course, relied on the Nile River to flood every year, ensuring that the land was fertilized and ready for crops. But there were also canals, dams, and other complex systems that needed constant maintenance. And who do you think was doing all that work? That's right, more forgotten laborers. These people had to make sure the water flowed properly, keeping everything from crops to drinking water available. They'd fix leaky canals, dig new ones, and ensure the flow of the Nile didn't suddenly run off course. Can you imagine what it must have been like to work in these systems? Trudging through mud, fixing walls, and making sure everything worked as intended. In the blistering heat of Egypt, I can only imagine how exhausting it must have been to fix cracks in a wall while standing knee-deep in water. But did they get a thank you from the pharaoh? No. Their names were never written down in the royal annals, and no one remembers them. Yet their work was just as vital as any of the grand construction projects the pharaohs embarked on. And what about the poor souls who worked in Egypt's quarries? These weren't the people who were laboring to build the grand pyramids, but rather those who spent their days working on smaller structures, monuments, and tombs. They would cut blocks of stone, and though they didn't get the glory of working on the Great Pyramid, they were still dealing with massive stones and heavy labor. The quarries were hot, dusty, and dangerous places to work. Think about the stone cutters who had to make sure every block was perfectly shaped and smooth. They didn't have power tools or modern machinery. No, these guys used simple tools like copper chisels and wooden mallets to do the work. And again, much like the brickmakers, they weren't given any credit. You'll never see a statue built in their honor. No, their existence is buried beneath the massive monuments we now associate with Egypt. But they were the ones who made it all possible. And let's not forget about the ancient Egyptian laundry workers. While I'm sure no one ever sat around wondering how laundry was done thousands of years ago, the truth is that someone had to do it. And it wasn't just the pharaoh's laundry that needed washing. It was everybody's. The ancient Egyptians didn't have washing machines or dryers. Nope. They had to hand wash everything using their hands and rudimentary tools to scrub clothes clean. Imagine standing in a river, scrubbing someone's tunic for hours under the beating sun, only to have to do it all over again the next day. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. And again, like so many other jobs in Egypt, it went unappreciated. The workers who cleaned the laundry for Egypt's elite weren't getting any recognition for their hard work. They weren't getting statues or fancy tombs built in their honor. They were just getting their daily meal and a roof over their heads, and likely not much else. Now, here's a job that might be even less glamorous than laundry: the ancient Egyptian water carrier. These workers would be responsible for transporting water from the Nile to homes and businesses in cities and villages. I know, it sounds easy enough on paper. Just fill up a bucket and walk across town, right? But it wasn't that simple. First of all, the Nile wasn't exactly close to every settlement. Imagine hauling heavy clay jugs of water for miles every day, just to make sure people could drink and wash. The weight of the water itself must have been exhausting, and the roads were likely treacherous and hot. You might even slip and spill the water. You'd have to keep walking, knowing that you were essentially the lifeline for a community's survival. Water carriers probably didn't get much attention from the upper class, but they played a crucial role in maintaining society. Without water, nothing else would have worked. So, if you ever feel like your job is getting a little too repetitive or thankless, just remember that ancient Egypt was filled with people who lived their entire lives without any recognition. They did the hard, dirty work that kept society running, and yet history doesn't remember their names. Their stories weren't carved into the walls of temples or memorialized in grand monuments. They were just the ones who quietly made sure everything worked. They were the unsung heroes of ancient Egypt. And while we may never know their names, we can still appreciate the work they did. Even if it was a job that no one wanted, it was the job that needed doing. Now, let's talk about one of the strangest yet most necessary jobs in ancient Egypt, those who worked with the Nile's floodwaters. Every year, the Nile would flood, leaving behind a rich layer of fertile soil, perfect for growing crops. You probably heard this, right? But what's more interesting and somewhat baffling is the sheer amount of labor that went into managing this natural phenomenon. Because while the Nile's annual flooding is often painted as a blessing, it was a nightmare for those who had to handle it. It wasn't just a matter of watching the river rise and then getting to work after the floodwaters receded. Oh no, it was an incredibly meticulous process, one that required constant attention to detail, careful planning, and honestly, some back-breaking work. The people who had this job were responsible for managing the irrigation systems that channeled this floodwater across the farmlands. Picture this: long days spent wading through muddy channels, ensuring that the water was directed just right, so that the crops would receive enough nourishment, but not so much that they drowned. It's the kind of job that might seem like it could be done in the blink of an eye, if only you had a few modern tools. But no, ancient Egypt wasn't exactly stocked with shiny new equipment for this task. Instead, it was up to people to dig canals by hand, build dikes, and use rudimentary tools to control the water flow, and they had to do this year after year. There was no off-season for irrigation workers. The Nile's whims dictated their schedule, and if the flood was too weak, well, that's another issue. Too much water meant crops were ruined, but too little meant starvation. It's a delicate balance that required constant monitoring. And then there were the farmers. Sure, most of us imagine ancient Egyptian farmers standing in fields with sickles, harvesting crops and looking incredibly majestic, but in reality, their days were long and grueling. Picture it. You wake up at the crack of dawn, already feeling the oppressive heat of the sun. The fields are vast and dry, and your back is sore from yesterday's work. You've got a sickle in your hand, and you're about to spend the next several hours bending over, cutting wheat, barley, or flax, whatever's in season. It's exhausting work, and let's face it, not glamorous in the slightest. While the farmers might have been essential to the Egyptian economy, there wasn't much glory in the day-to-day grind. Their names weren't recorded in the annals of history. No statues of them were erected. Yet, without them, Egypt would have crumbled. Then there were the laborers who worked on the great building projects, like the pyramids or temples. We've all heard about these monumental feats, but let's be real. The actual work of construction wasn't as exciting as the history books make it sound. Sure, the pyramids were impressive, but when you're a laborer in ancient Egypt, your job isn't to marvel at the massive stones being moved into place. It's to lift those stones. It's to drag them across the sand brick by brick, or rather, block by block. Imagine that. Hours upon hours of hauling huge stones with nothing but the relentless desert sun beating down on you. You'd probably think the sun was your only friend, but nope, it was just another force in the miserable reality of that work. Despite how monumental the pyramids were, the laborers weren't exactly rewarded with lavish rewards. They were paid, yes, but not in the same way that other craftsmen might be. Instead of gold or silver, they often received food and shelter. And those who worked on the pyramids? They didn't get to just take breaks whenever they wanted. They were working under strict deadlines. They were pushing toward an end goal. But the work itself? Endless. There was no satisfaction in completing a project because, well, the project didn't get finished in a day. And so you'd go home at the end of each day exhausted, with no sense of accomplishment, just knowing that you'd have to get up and do it all over again the next day. It's not like the ancient Egyptians had a thriving social scene for laborers either. Sure, there were festivals and celebrations, but most of those were for the elite, not for those getting their hands dirty in the sand. Imagine looking at the glittering palaces, the grand temples, and knowing that you would never get to live in one of those. You'd never wear a linen tunic made from the finest fabrics or eat lavish meals. You'd never ride in a chariot or wear jewelry adorned with gold. Nope. Your life was one of sweat, sore muscles, and long, tiring hours spent building something that would eventually become part of history. But you'd never be remembered. But here's the thing. Even the most mundane jobs in ancient Egypt had their place. Take, for example, the humble job of a water carrier. Sure, you weren't getting any glory for your efforts, but you were providing a vital service to society. Without people carrying water, civilization wouldn't have functioned. It's the kind of thankless task that, in modern times, we often overlook. We have pipes and plumbing now, so we don't think twice about turning on a tap. But back then, you had to carry heavy jars of water from the river to your home, day in, day out. You'd be lugging water for miles, your arms aching, your back protesting, all just to make sure that life could go on. You probably didn't get a lot of recognition, but without you, nothing would have worked. Without water, you couldn't irrigate the crops, you couldn't clean, and you certainly couldn't drink. So, in the grand scheme of things, the water carrier was doing more for society than anyone ever gave them credit for. And then there were those strange, forgotten occupations, like the ones who worked in the ancient Egyptian brewery. It's easy to think of beer as a modern luxury, or even as something that's only enjoyed by a few. But in ancient Egypt, beer was a staple. It was something that nearly everyone drank, from the pharaohs to the laborers. So, who brewed the beer? Well, that's where the brewery workers came in. Their job was a vital one. They were the ones responsible for ensuring that the beer was properly brewed, that the fermentation process went as planned, and that the drink was ready for consumption. But it wasn't glamorous. You weren't getting any recognition for your hard work, just a steady stream of beer to serve and a constant need to make sure that it tasted just right. Can you imagine that? Spending your entire life brewing beer? It's probably not what you would think of when you imagine the grandeur of ancient Egypt, but hey, it was a necessary job, and without it, the society would have fallen apart. The beer kept people hydrated. It was part of religious rituals, and it served as a social lubricant. So, there's that. Being a brewery worker was important, even if it wasn't exactly the most exciting career path. And let's not forget the job of a scribe. Oh, the scribe. It's easy to think of scribes as incredibly important people in ancient Egypt, and sure they were. They wrote down laws, kept records, and documented history. But let's break it down. Being a scribe wasn't exactly a walk in the park. For one, you had to learn how to write in hieroglyphs, which wasn't exactly the easiest thing to pick up. Imagine spending your childhood learning to carve tiny, intricate symbols onto stone tablets, or writing long passages on papyrus scrolls. Your hands would be sore, your mind exhausted, and the pressure to get things right would be immense. One mistake, and it could ruin an entire record. So yeah, while scribes may have enjoyed some prestige, their job wasn't all glamorous. It was about precision and patience, qualities that were probably more exhausting than we give credit for. Now, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about another odd job, the role of the tomb cleaner. This job wasn't one that many people would have dreamed of doing, but someone had to do it. After all, tombs were sacred places in ancient Egypt, and they had to be maintained. If you think about it, it's not hard to imagine how dirty these tombs could get over time. Dust, debris, and even the remains of offerings would accumulate. The tomb cleaner was tasked with ensuring that these sacred spaces remained pristine. It was a job that required a great deal of attention to detail and a bit of patience, but it was also a job that wasn't exactly glamorous. It wasn't the kind of role that would have you basking in glory, but it was one that kept the tombs looking proper for the afterlife. Being a tomb cleaner wasn't about getting praise. It was about doing a job that needed to be done day in and day out. And that's something that many people in ancient Egypt did. They did the work that needed to be done, no matter how strange or boring it might have seemed. And while we might never remember their names, they played a crucial part in the survival and continuity of Egyptian society. In fact, a lot of the most vital jobs in ancient Egypt were like that, necessary but largely uncelebrated. From the irrigation workers to the water carriers, to the brewery employees and tomb cleaners, these roles were the backbone of Egypt's economy and culture. Without them, the entire civilization would have crumbled. Yet, their efforts went largely unnoticed in the grand scope of history. So next time you think about ancient Egypt, think about all the people whose names we'll never know. The ones who worked tirelessly in the background, making sure everything ran smoothly. Now, when we think of ancient Egypt, our minds often drift to the pyramids, the grandiose temples, and the legendary rulers. But honestly, for most people, it wasn't about building monumental structures or mingling with pharaohs. It was about getting through the grind of day-to-day life, doing the repetitive, often dull tasks that kept everything running. Imagine waking up at the crack of dawn, your back already sore from yesterday's labor, knowing that another day of monotonous work lay ahead. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't thrilling, but it was essential, and honestly, it's hard to think of a place more bizarrely dedicated to such strange, almost invisible roles than ancient Egypt. Take, for example, the humble scribe. Sure, you might be picturing someone sitting in the royal court, writing out beautiful hieroglyphs for the pharaoh, living a life of luxury and prestige. But that wasn't the reality for most scribes. While some did indeed have cushy positions in the court, many scribes were more like glorified accountants or bureaucrats. They spent their days recording grain shipments, inventorying tax collections, and making sure that the pharaoh's endless demands for resources were met without fail. Now, writing in a script that's as confusing as hieroglyphs can't be easy, but imagine doing it for hours on end, day after day. It's not as glamorous as it seems. There's nothing particularly poetic about jotting down the same tax records for the 1,000th time, or scribbling the inventory for the pharaoh's massive hoards of grain. But without these scribes, the whole economy could have collapsed in on itself. And speaking of taxes, someone had to collect them. You might think that being a tax collector in ancient Egypt would have been a cushy job, right? But imagine being the person who had to knock on every farmer's door, collecting goods, animals, and sometimes even labor. And there was no, "I'll pay you next week" kind of deal. Taxes had to be collected in full. And if you're the one knocking on doors, how do you think the locals are going to treat you? Yeah, not too kindly. Imagine walking down the street, knowing that your next knock might result in an angry farmer or, worse, an upset family. No matter how you slice it, it was a job that no one was ever going to thank you for. But it had to be done. The pharaoh had his demands, and those demands trickled down, one angry tax collector at a time. Then there are the priests, who seem to get a lot of attention in the history books. But don't be fooled. Priests didn't just sit around in fancy robes performing rituals for the gods. Some did, yes. But others, well, many of them were tasked with far less exciting jobs like managing the massive temple estates. And the estate management was hardly a luxurious gig. It meant overseeing land, dealing with all the agricultural stuff, ensuring that every piece of grain or livestock was accounted for. In other words, it was like being a farm manager, but on a grand scale and far more tedious. Now, imagine overseeing thousands of acres of farmland, dealing with constant reports of crop yields, organizing laborers, and keeping track of every little detail. All of this had to be done while maintaining the illusion of divine favor, of course. If the crops failed, or there was a bad harvest, the first thing you had to do was assure everyone that the gods weren't angry at you. They were angry at someone, sure, but you'd rather not be the one they looked to for the answer. And let's not forget about the actual farm laborers. These people were the backbone of ancient Egypt. They might not have been the ones deciding where the grain went or who got taxed, but they were the ones working tirelessly under the hot sun, day after day. It was exhausting. The work was grueling, back-breaking, and often thankless. Their job was to plow the fields, sow the seeds, tend to the crops, and harvest them. Pretty much the same things we still do today. But imagine doing it in Egypt's sweltering heat, with no modern conveniences, just the sun, the soil, and the never-ending monotony of farm work. And all for a fraction of what the higher-ups took home at the end of the day. If you think that's bad, let's move on to something a little more, let's say, peculiar. One job that doesn't get enough attention is the mummy preparer. I mean, we all know that ancient Egyptians loved their mummies. But have you ever stopped to think about the people who had to deal with the actual mummification process? And no, it wasn't just the priests. There were specialized workers whose sole job was to clean the bodies, remove the organs, and wrap them up in linen. This wasn't the kind of job you did for fun. It was hot, smelly, and often involved dealing with fluids that would make most modern people gag. Yet it had to be done. The process was time-consuming and involved every detail being just right, from the exact amount of embalming resin used to the careful wrapping of the body. But hey, at least it paid the bills, right? And much like the other tasks we've talked about, it was vital to the whole operation. If there were no mummies, what would happen to the gods? What would happen to the afterlife? Not much, probably. Now, let's take a step back and consider something even stranger. The job of a sand sifter. This one is truly bizarre. Picture it. You've got a team of people who are tasked with going through vast amounts of sand, sometimes literally miles of it, just to sift out any tiny bit of treasure or artifact that might have been lost over the centuries. It sounds almost absurd, right? Yet this job was important. The ancient Egyptians loved their treasures, and any lost relic, no matter how small, was precious. These workers would spend their days bending over the desert, sifting and sorting through dust and sand, hoping for a glimmer of gold, an ancient bead, or some long-forgotten stone. It was back-breaking work for the slim chance of finding something of value. And yet, without these diligent sand sifters, many of the treasures we associate with ancient Egypt would have been lost forever, buried beneath the sands of time. And if you think sand sifting sounds like a miserable job, wait until you hear about the water carriers. I know, it sounds simple enough. They carried water. But it wasn't just about filling up a couple of jugs and walking to the nearest well. Oh, no. Water carriers had to haul water from the Nile, sometimes miles away, in the scorching heat. They'd make these trips several times a day, carrying heavy, often poorly designed containers on their backs. You can just imagine what a nightmare this was, especially considering that the Nile's water levels fluctuated, and sometimes the flow wasn't quite as generous as it needed to be. So, these workers were constantly having to find new sources, find new ways of managing their loads, and doing so under the oppressive weight of the sun. No one thanked them. No one praised them. They just hauled water all day, every day. But again, without them, none of the rest of it. No crops, no irrigation, no buildings would have happened. And while we're talking about water, let's not forget the role of the irrigation workers. These individuals were responsible for making sure the Nile's floodwaters reached all the fields, as well as ensuring the irrigation systems were in working order. It was like being a plumber, but on a massive scale. The canals, dikes, and reservoirs needed constant attention. And while today's plumbers have tools, modern materials, and a bit more appreciation for their work, irrigation workers in ancient Egypt had none of that. They dealt with muddy water, broken channels, and constant maintenance, all while being exposed to diseases, vermin, and the constant risk of floods. It wasn't the kind of job you did if you were looking for a comfortable life, but it was the kind of job that held everything else together. If the irrigation system failed, everything failed. And who would blame the pharaohs for being upset about that? Certainly not the people doing the hard work, but they kept at it, just like everyone else. And so it went on. Whether you were a fisherman, a builder, or a potter, your day was filled with small, seemingly insignificant tasks that kept the entire system from falling apart. It wasn't about glory. It wasn't about fame. It was about doing the job that had to be done, the work that, even though it seemed boring, even though it seemed strange, was absolutely essential to keeping Egypt as one of the most powerful and enduring civilizations of the ancient world. But what about those other jobs? The ones that didn't involve grand projects or public displays of skill, but still managed to be crucial to the fabric of ancient Egyptian society? Well, These were the day-to-day roles that kept things ticking along, mostly unnoticed. But if they were gone, everything would fall apart. They might have been mundane, but without them, there would be no system. Ancient Egypt would have collapsed without these often forgotten workers. Let's start with the scribes. Now, you might think that being a scribe in ancient Egypt was a prestigious job, but let me tell you, the reality wasn't as glamorous as you might imagine. Sure, scribes had access to education, and sure, they could read and write. Two skills that set them apart from the vast majority of the population. But beyond that, it was pretty much a paperwork nightmare. They sat at their desks for hours, painstakingly copying religious texts, inventories, and tax records. And get this, most of the time, they were using reed pens and ink made from soot, and the papyrus they wrote on was as fragile as you can imagine. Mistakes? They could cost a scribe their job, or worse. If you think Excel spreadsheets are bad, try using reed pens in the blistering Egyptian heat to copy down hundreds of names, dates, and measurements without making an error. Sounds relaxing, right? And then there were the priestly scribes, the ones who had to preserve the sacred texts. Those scribes had to keep track of everything from religious rites to the gods' offerings. And they weren't just writing for the pharaoh. They were writing for the gods, too. Imagine the pressure. One misplaced symbol could upset the entire religious system. Do you want to be the one to explain to the gods that you misspelled their name? Didn't think so. The scribes weren't the only ones getting the short end of the stick. Let's talk about the bakers. Now, baking bread sounds like an easy job, but in ancient Egypt, it was nothing like what we know today. The baker's day started early, much earlier than you'd expect. The first thing they did was light the fire. Imagine getting up at dawn to tend to a massive clay oven that could burn you at any second. Then, after the fire was going, they had to mix flour, water, and salt to make the dough. And this wasn't your average dough. This was a thick, heavy paste that had to be kneaded for hours by hand. Think of it as the ultimate workout, only you weren't trying to get fit. You were just trying to make bread. After that, there was no fancy bread slicer or timer to tell you when the bread was done. No. The baker had to rely on experience to know when the bread was ready, and sometimes they get it wrong. Imagine spending hours baking bread only to have it come out burnt. And all you had to show for it was the smell of burnt dough in your hair. Then, of course, there were the weavers. They were the ones who made the linens that everyone, from the richest pharaoh to the poorest farmer, wore. But again, it wasn't like we have today. There was no one-size-fits-all. The weavers worked with thread and dye, creating fabrics that were often so intricately woven that you could barely tell which way was up. This job required intense focus, and even then, mistakes could happen. One tiny slip in the weaving process, and the entire piece could be ruined. So, while the weavers were making clothes, they were also walking the fine line between producing a beautiful piece of work and having to start all over again from scratch. They were constantly under pressure to get the weave just right. If you think about it, it's kind of like the ultimate form of fast fashion. Only instead of a couple of weeks to make something, they had days or weeks, working from dawn until sunset. The amount of sweat that went into making one robe must have been staggering. But don't forget about the barbers. Yes, barbers. They were in charge of shaving heads, trimming beards, and, get this, sometimes even taking care of the pharaoh's personal hygiene. Imagine being the person tasked with keeping the pharaoh's head shaved smooth, always looking perfect. No pressure there. But here's the kicker. In ancient Egypt, hair wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a symbol of purity, of power, of status. If you messed up a shave, you could risk offending someone very important. And in the world of ancient Egypt, that was a very bad thing. So, barbers weren't just skilled with a razor, they had to be diplomatic too. They had to understand when to keep their mouth shut and when to ask the pharaoh about the weather. Because no one wanted to be the barber who got on the wrong side of the royal family. And speaking of personal grooming, we also have to talk about the embalmers. These guys weren't just preparing dead bodies for the afterlife, they were dealing with a significant number of corpses, and their job was messy. We're talking about removing internal organs, covering bodies in salt, and wrapping them up in linen, all while making sure the body didn't rot. If you're picturing this as a glamorous, ritualistic affair, you're wrong. It was a dirty, stinky, and incredibly long process. The embalmers were often up to their elbows in preservatives and oils, trying to preserve the dead for eternity. But despite the grotesque nature of the work, there was an upside. Embalmers were among the few who had access to royal tombs. That meant a certain level of respect, and even the chance to talk to the higher-ups about the most important matters of the day. The health of the dead, obviously. Not the most ideal career for those squeamish about the smell of decay, though. And then, of course, we have the fishermen. Now, fishing in ancient Egypt wasn't just a leisurely activity. It wasn't like strolling down to your local lake with a rod and reel. No, these fishermen were serious business. They had to deal with dangerous waters, unpredictable fish populations, and the constant threat of their boats capsizing. The work was physical, demanding, and often wet, and they did it day after day, without the luxury of a relaxing afternoon by the river with a sandwich in hand. They had nets to throw, lines to manage, and fish to bring back to their families, all while dealing with the scorching heat and stinking fish that would follow them around for hours. Even worse, the Nile wasn't always friendly. During the dry season, the river could become so shallow that fishing became nearly impossible, and during the flood season, the waters could rise and ruin entire harvests. For the fishermen, it was a game of chance, a gamble against nature, and the only thing they could do was keep casting their nets, hoping for a good catch. Just imagine the satisfaction of catching a giant fish only to have it fall off the hook at the last second. That must have been the worst. But don't think for a second that the workers of ancient Egypt were a one-trick pony. In fact, many of them worked multiple jobs just to make ends meet. Some people were builders by day and potters by night. Others were stone cutters during the week and scribes during their off hours. The need for survival meant that people couldn't afford to just do one thing. They had to wear multiple hats. So, if you thought your 9 to 5 was hard, just try being an ancient Egyptian who's constantly running from one job to the next, hoping to get everything done in time. And all of this was happening in the sweltering heat of the desert, under the relentless Egyptian sun. There were no breaks, no time off. You worked until you couldn't work anymore. That was the reality for most Egyptians. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't exciting, but it kept the entire society running. No job was too small. Even the ones that seemed incredibly dull, like the work of a brickmaker, had to be done. Because without those bricks, there would be no pyramids. Without those scribes, there would be no record of Egypt's greatness, and so it was for thousands of years. While the pharaohs lived in their palaces, surrounded by luxury, the workers were in the fields, in the workshops, and in the villages, doing the dirty, boring, and sometimes downright unpleasant work that held the kingdom together. These were the forgotten jobs, the ones that didn't make it into the history books, but without which ancient Egypt would never have existed in the first place. The next time you think about ancient Egypt, think not just of the grandeur of the pyramids, the glory of the pharaohs, or the wisdom of the gods. Think of the bakers, the scribes, the fishermen, the barbers, and all the other people who spent their days in the shadows, doing the mundane but essential tasks that made civilization possible. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't easy, but it was necessary. So let's take a moment to think about the job of a water carrier. Sounds a bit mundane, doesn't it? Yet, in ancient Egypt, this was an essential role that you don't hear about in the usual grand stories. Picture this. The Nile River, a giant lifeline for all of Egypt, flowing through the heart of the kingdom. It wasn't just a scenic backdrop for the pyramids. It was the primary source of water for drinking, farming, and even building. Yet, for all its life-giving properties, the Nile didn't exactly offer water right where people needed it. So, someone had to bring it, and that's where the water carriers came in. Now, imagine waking up before dawn, grabbing your clay jars, and heading down to the riverbank. You fill those jars, carry them on your head, possibly all day long, just to deliver it to people's homes or workplaces. All for the privilege of being called a water carrier. No fame, no glory, just sweat, heavy loads, and a life in service to others. It wasn't glamorous, but without those water carriers, the bustling cities of ancient Egypt would have been in big trouble. And speaking of essential yet overlooked jobs, let's not forget about the bath attendants. If you've ever taken a nice hot bath, you know the effort it takes just to set everything up. Now, imagine you had to do that for a living, not in the privacy of your own home, but in a public bathhouse. You'd be responsible for ensuring the water was the right temperature, getting the soap ready, and keeping everything tidy, all while managing to avoid any awkward encounters with a variety of sweaty and often grumpy customers. It's not the kind of job you'd brag about, but it was necessary in a society that valued cleanliness, especially when you consider that Egypt had public bathhouses as early as 4,000 years ago. Oh, and we can't forget the job of the nose kisser. Yes, you read that correctly. In ancient Egypt, there were people who had the particular duty of applying a special ointment to the noses of the elite. It might sound odd to us now, but in a society obsessed with hygiene and fragrance, the role of the nose kisser was to ensure that the pharaohs and nobles always smelled pleasant. There were certain scents and oils that were considered divine, and only those who were entrusted with such delicate tasks could handle them. It was a strange mix of ritual and personal grooming, essential to the social fabric, but probably one of the last jobs anyone would want to talk about at a dinner party. As you can see, ancient Egypt wasn't just about pharaohs and priests. Beneath the surface, there was a vast network of men and women doing the work that made life possible. Their roles, while often repetitive and tedious, were the lifeblood of the civilization. They were the ones who made sure the wheels of society kept turning, even if it was in the quietest, most unnoticed ways. The next time you imagine ancient Egypt, don't just think of grand monuments or epic battles. Think of the people who kept it all together with their strange, forgotten occupations, jobs that no one ever talks about, but without which Egypt, as we know it, would not have existed.